Big hello to all the viewers. Welcome again to the DLife.in channel. I'm Shashikant Iyengar, your host today. I'm a DLife.in member and a volunteer. And for all those watching this program, this is not a medical or nutrition advice. It's just a sharing of information. People are requested to take the guidance of their doctor and a low carb nutritionist for any change. Also, there are no financials attached to this session. All are free of cost to disseminate genuine information. So, DLife is a community platform for low carbers. It's a platform for those suffering from diabetes, obesity, PCOS, and other metabolic syndrome like hypertension. And DLife has over 250 success stories. There are more than 1,200 dishes, low carb Indian dishes. DLife was actually founded by Anup Singh, who is an engineer from IIT. Recently, Anup Singh and DLife has been recognized and awarded as icons of India by Outlook magazine for pioneering low carb in India. They also recently launched a diploma in low carb nutrition for those wishing to help others in a more scientific and systematic manner. So, viewers, today I welcome all of you, uh, especially those who have come from abroad, and I welcome all from India, and I especially welcome Nina Teicholz, who's our guest today, and who is going to speak on a few topics. Welcome, Nina. Welcome to India virtually.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm
So,
impressed by your group.
so Nina, how is it? I mean, have you ever addressed the Indian population before?
Yes, I've visited India. I had a friend who is married there, a friend from college. So yes, I've been to Mumbai and Goa,
Wow.
and have spent time there. And well, it's just a stunning country that I can't wait to visit and return to.
Fine, Nina. So, Nina, I'm based at Mumbai personally. So, few of us here are also based in Mumbai, plus various parts of India. So, so for viewers, welcome again. And I'll just introduce Nina Teicholz. All the low carbers who are worth their salt, they all know Nina Teicholz. So Nina is a science journalist, is an author of the New York Times, is author of New York Times bestseller, The Big Fat Surprise. Each one of us have, most of the low carbers almost have read this Big Fat Surprise, which has upended the conventional wisdom on dietary fat, especially about saturated fat. And it has spurred a new conversation about whether these fats are in fact bad or good, causing heart disease. Named as best book of the year by Economist, Wall Street Journal, and Mother Jones, among others. It continues to be called as a must read for anyone seeking to understand the amazing story of how we came to believe that fat is bad for health and what a better diet might look like. Nina is also the founder of Nutrition Coalition, a non-profit working to ensure that the government nutrition policy is transparent and evidence-based work, for which she has been asked to testify before the US Department of Agriculture and the Canadian Senate. Teicholz is a graduate of Stanford and Oxford Universities and previously served as Associate Director of the Center of Globalization and Sustainable Development at Columbia University. So, Nina, welcome again to India.
Thank
Welcome
you,
to
thank you.
welcome to D Life
Thank you very
platform.
much.
We are really lucky to have a very big personality like you.
Thank
And
you.
so, Nina, please tell us about your background. What actually was your background earlier?
Well, I think one thing that I should say, it's usually at the beginning of any scientific talk that a person might give, which is your disclosures. It's important for me to say that I do not receive any money from any industry. I don't endorse any products. I really come to this as a journalist and as an open-minded person. I myself was actually a vegetarian, and I didn't eat any red meat and no butter for more than 2 decades. And it really took me a very long time to overcome my inhibition towards those foods. I researched my book, which involved interviewing hundreds of scientists and reading many thousands of scientific papers for nearly a decade before it came out. And I didn't know really very much about nutrition beforehand. It all began because I was assigned as a journalist a story on trans fats in the early 2000s, something I didn't know anything about trans fats. And that really pulled me into this fascinating world of dietary fats. it was fascinating because it was clear from the start that it was so political. I would call up scientists. This is only 20 years ago when scientists would not even talk about dietary fats. The idea that the low fat diet might not be good for health was something that scientists would tell me, if we're going to talk about this, I cannot speak to you, and would hang up on me. I would come off of phone calls sometimes sort of shaking, like I felt like I had been investigating the mob or some terrible crime. And I also heard stories of people who were harassed and heckled at scientific conferences, or who had had their papers yanked from journals before publication, or who had been visited by officials from the margarine industry trying to stop their work. This was this was sort of dazzling to me, and something I had never imagined that science worked this way. And of course, dietary fat is, for somebody my age, is something, and really for most people, is something that we have obsessed about for most of our lives. You know, how much fat, good fat, bad fat, what kind of fat should we eat? Should we eat foods with these kinds of fats or those kinds of fats? It has been a pillar of our dietary advice. So it really pulled me in, this subject, the importance of it, and the seeming, the bizarre misconduct that I immediately saw when I started researching. I mean, 10 years later, I had a book, and I really had come to believe pretty much the opposite of what I had long thought and followed for the majority of my life. Um, so I should also say that I'm from Berkeley, California, which is an extremely liberal, progressive town in California. And so I couldn't imagine that the government could do something that could be wrong, or so deeply wrong, as I believe that our nutrition guidance is. So again, that was for me a very big shift in my thinking.
I think you have traveled a long way from being, from you yourself being a vegetarian to, avoid using all this saturated fatty acid, to back to sad fats. And I think it's really, when I really read your book and read about you, it's really apparent that you are really stirred a hornet's nest, or you just
Yeah.
put yourself inside a mob, and you really had to work really hard. So Nina, what we want to understand is, can you tell us something about traditional fats? Down in your country, like in India, the traditional fat has always been ghee. Ghee has been the contribution of India to the world, and I will say that it is the contribution of India to the low carb world, especially. And please tell us about the traditional fat outside there and in many other countries also, because your research is very extensive.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for ghee, which has enjoying much greater popularity now in the United States. In the Western world, the traditional fats for cooking and for all use were lard, and which comes from pigs, and butter, so which comes from cows, as you know. There was also the use, less so, but also the use of suet, which is the fat around the organs of ruminant animals, and tallow. And these were the really the main fats that were used. There was almost no use of oil at all until, I mean, olive oil wasn't used in the Mediterranean region, although it's famous for it. It really was not used to eat as a foodstuff until the 19th century. Before that, and its famous long history really was, it was used to as an ointment to polish up your muscles. So even olive oil is not as ancient. Our use of fats traditionally has long been saturated fats. These animal fats, and I should say that all fats, uh, animal fats, plant-based fats, they all contain a combination of fatty acids. So they contain some saturated fatty acids, some unsaturated fatty acids. So they're all a combination. And in fact, all foods contain some small amount of different kinds of fatty acids. But it's fair to say that uh, meat and dairy especially, more than meat even, contain more saturated fatty acids than it does other kinds of fats. So I want to just tell a little bit of the story of my book, which
Yeah,
I'm delighted that people
yeah.
have read. But what is the origin story for how we came to distrust saturated fats? And it's worth repeating just so people know. I mean, it is an idea that has a fixed moment in time when it was born, and that was in the 1950s in the United States, when our nation was in a sort of panic over the rising tide of heart disease, which had been very rare in the early 1900s and had come by the 1950s to be the number one killer of men, especially. Our president, Eisenhower, then had a heart attack in 1955 and was out of his office for 10 whole days. You'll remember recently when our president Trump was in the hospital for even a couple of days and there was nothing else on the news. So here we had President Eisenhower for 10 whole days, not in his office, and every day there was coverage of his condition. And this focused the attention of the whole country on this issue of what causes heart disease and heart attacks. And really nobody knew. And there were a number of competing theories or hypotheses. One was that it was vitamin deficiency that caused heart disease. Another was the rising tide of auto exhaust because there were more and more cars on the road. And there was another theory that it was the type A personality, which was the highly stressed person that would go around yelling at everybody and then seize up and have a heart attack and fall over and die. But there was the theory we know so well today called the diet heart hypothesis that was proposed by a physiologist at the University of Minnesota whose name is Ancel Keys. Keys suggested that it was saturated fats and cholesterol that were the problems in the diet, and they would lead to an increase in the cholesterol in your blood, and that cholesterol would build up in your and clog your arteries, sort of like hot oil going down a cold stovepipe or a sink drain. And this building up and clogging would cause a heart attack. And that was his idea, the diet heart hypothesis. Well, this was just his idea, but Ancel Keys turned out to be an extremely persuasive and aggressive individual. His friends would say he would argue anybody to the death. You would just get exhausted trying to argue with him because he had such a forceful personality and he had such unshakable faith in his own beliefs. And he was able to get himself onto the nutrition committee of the American Heart Association. The American Heart Association was the premier official group in the United States dealing with heart disease. And in 1960, let's just call it the AHA, had no advice for the public about diet because they said, we just don't have any data. Ancel Keys joins the committee 1 year later, no greater data, but he's able to convince everybody to issue a statement saying that men, heart disease was still a condition only of men, should avoid saturated fat and cholesterol as the most important measure of protection against heart disease. And that is really where it all began. The first official pronouncement that people should avoid saturated fat and cholesterol to prevent heart disease. It's like a little acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have today, where every official organization around the world still endorses at least half of the diet heart hypothesis, which is the part on saturated fat. It's important to note that most authorities have dropped their limitations on cholesterol. So the reason we've avoided egg yolks, shellfish, foods high in cholesterol, that was one of the pillars of the diet heart hypothesis. But most organizations now have dropped that advice. I don't know about India, but I know that as of 2015, we have no more official advice to limit cholesterol. So that was the beginning of it all. And specifically, I want to say, since I know we want to talk about vegetable oils here, the advice was to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats. So replace meat, dairy, butter with polyunsaturated vegetable oils, replace butter with margarine. So in some cases, there were clear replacements, in some cases not. But it emphasized that people should consume polyunsaturated fats. I wouldn't mind just sharing one slide so people understand
Yeah,
what that
please,
means.
please.
I think that This is really helpful.
Yeah,
This is, can you see this now?
yeah, yeah,
Okay,
clearly.
so this is just to show you the chemistry of this is a molecule of a saturated fatty acid. You can see that there are very few double bonds. Those kind of look what looks like an equals sign between uh, uh, a carbon and an oxygen. So saturated fats is a flat molecule, so it can stack up against each other, and that's why it's solid at room temperature. The unsaturated fatty acid is a squiggly molecule, and that's why it can't stack up neatly, and that's why those create oils. And each one of those double bonds, which we can talk about later, but each one of those double bonds is an opportunity, especially under heat or light, as you know from chemistry, that speeds up chemical reactions. Each of those double bonds is an opportunity to open up and connect with an oxygen. So that is oxidation. That is oxidation. And these unsaturated fatty acids are much more likely to oxidize. That means go rancid, go bad, and in the body when consumed create inflammation. So I'll just give you an example of what happens in some heating applications, such as when you go out, you eat French fries, they're always fried in this kind of oil.
That's
All
true.
right.
I think that is something which is commonly seen across, even in India, we have our own Indian snacks which are deep fried in such oil. And the worst part in India is it might be prevalent abroad also. I don't know that we reuse the oil. We in
Right.
fact, that container is never emptied, and then it is kept on reheated and kept on being reused. So that was a nice history which you told us. But what is the history of these seed oils? Where was it used earlier, and how suddenly it has come? That we know that because saturated fat was demonized by Ansel Keys, and that's how it has happened. But what is the origin? I mean, what is the origin of seed oils? Where were they used earlier? How comes it suddenly they come into the human food chain?
Great question. Um, so oils have, cold pressed oils were used in small amounts in many different countries, but they really were not the primary source of fat for people to consume. They would be pressed out of nuts or seeds. The use of oils in our food supply did not happen in a major way until the beginning of the 20th century. So, what happened was that in America, are a byproduct. There's nothing to do with them, but they discovered that you could press them and create an oil called cottonseed oil. This was very much needed in the late 1900s because they were needed for as the lubricant for the Industrial Revolution. There was a great need for lubricants for machinery. And previously, that oil had been supplied by whales. Whales were primarily hunted for their oil. But then, when the whale population started dwindling, there was a need for alternative sources. One of the large ones became cottonseed. And then, in the beginnings of the 20th century, sorry, I have my dates. The I'm talking about the late 1800s as the time of the Industrial Revolution and the need for oils. Okay, so then in the early 1900s, there was a product. There was a team called Procter and Gamble. It was a soap and a tallow maker who joined together, and they were able to take these oils, which remember they're unstable molecules. They oxidize easily. They were able to figure out a process to harden those oils, and basically they took that squiggly molecule and put it through an industrial process involving um, a chemical reaction, and they were able to straighten out those oils into straight chains so they could become hard, or they could stack up and be a solid fat. That process was called hydrogenation, and you could or partial hydrogenation. And so they were able to make a solid fat out of cottonseed oil. And again, I'll share a slide with you,
Yeah.
which is they looked at this substance and they said, well, we think that this could be Are you seeing this now?
Yeah,
Yes.
Crisco.
Okay. They said, we think this could be a foodstuff for people to consume. They had to deodorize it and winterize it and create and bleach it so that it looked proper. But it was basically, it was this product, Crisco, and it was used to replace butter and also lard, which, as I said, had been the traditional cooking fat. This came into the food supply in 1911. It came along with a massive advertising campaign, sort of making the argument that this was a new, clean fat. It didn't involve the abattoirs or the you didn't have to kill animals to have this fat. This was very appealing because it was sort of clean, came out of a chemical laboratory. And for Americans, there was also always the dream of the immigrant to sort of do away with the old traditions from the old country and adopt the new. So this became adopted widely. And there was also later on, there was the development of margarine, which added yellow coloring in order to replace butter. And then there was further development in sort of the chemistry of dealing and stabilizing these oils that they figured out by the 1940s, the late 1940s, they were able to sell vegetable oil in bottles as we know it today. They were able to figure out a sort of a chemical trick to allow those oils to be relatively stable. So that's how they entered the food supply, from almost 0% of our consumption to now the dominant. I mean, it's really the dominant source of fat. It has risen uh, to 8 or 9% of all the calories that we eat in the United States, and I'm sure there's a similar number in India. So it's the most dramatic change in any foodstuff that we have made over the course of the last century or so. It's really quite a dramatic change. And one of the reasons that I was really interested in researching these oils, because there really had not been very much research into them. It was an area where, as I sort of described earlier, where the people who were researching these oils and finding unpleasant facts about them, those were the ones that had their papers yanked or were heckled at conferences, scientific conferences, because this was a huge burgeoning industry, and these scientists really were not welcome in the scientific community for sort of creating this kind of upheaval.
So I think one reason why this unsaturated fatty acids have come probably is because they also reduce LDL. So that has become very attractive, along with this diet heart hypothesis. So that has also entered in the food stream, and probably because saturated fat to some extent it can probably raise LDL. Maybe it is a good LDL which it raises, but then again that is how it has got a bad rap. So what is your view on the overall usage of sat fat? How is the incidence of heart disease earlier, and how you can correlate now? Earlier we used to use sat fat, and then now it is more of these PUFA oils. So so
Yes.
so what was your investigation which has shown on? You can throw some light on this.
Well, at first, I want to address the issue of LDL cholesterol,
Yeah.
which is important and I think is a major stumbling block for people. When the diet heart hypothesis was proposed by Ansel Keys, of course, they weren't measuring LDL at that point. They were just measuring total cholesterol.
Yeah.
And they found that your saturated fats would raise your total cholesterol. It was later found by the early 1980s in observational studies that your total cholesterol really did not track very well with your long-term cardiovascular risk, like if you were going to have a heart attack or die from heart disease. And that is why actually if you look at the American Heart Association's risk calculator for your future
Yeah.
your heart disease risk score, it doesn't include total cholesterol anymore for that reason. But then it sort of shifted to LDL. Saturated fat tends to raise your LDL, vegetable oils tend to lower it. Well, this theory has also, there's cracks in this theory as well. And I will just describe two of them. One is that it turns out LDL cholesterol is more complicated than we think. There are particles of LDL, and there are sort of large buoyant ones, which really have much less risk for heart disease. And then there are small dense ones that are the ones that are considered atherogenic or heart disease causing. Saturated fat, it turns out, raises the large buoyant ones and not the small dense ones. And so the kind of LDL, the type of LDL that saturated fat raises is really not the kind that threatens your risk, your heart disease risk. I think another really important point is that although there is some evidence from the pharmaceutical companies that lowering your LDL with drugs is protective against heart disease, that is disputed, but I still think that's a common belief. The clinical trials on diet have never been able to show the same effect. In other words, people would lower their LDL by, on average, 13% in many of the clinical trials that were done on saturated fat. So they successfully lowered LDL cholesterol, but they never could see an effect on cardiovascular mortality or total mortality, and in most cases on any kind of cardiovascular events. So that link, when you lower your LDL through diet, could not be shown to be true or was not reliably supported by the evidence. And there's another sort of twist here, which is that saturated fats are the only food that is known to raise your so-called good cholesterol, your HDL cholesterol. If your HDL is low, when you go to the doctor and say, how can I raise my HDL? As I did once, they said, you can drink alcohol, which I didn't do, didn't drink, or you can exercise. Those will raise your HDL just a little bit. But what I only discovered from my research is that saturated fats is the most reliable way to raise your HDL. It also helps to lower your carbohydrate intake when you do that. And all of that will, the observational studies show that your HDL to ratio, from your ratio of HDL to triglycerides, which are the fatty acids in your blood, is the most predictive of the things that are commonly measured at regular doctor checkups. That is the most predictive and powerful number to help you predict your risk. And this is a ratio that is improved by increasing saturated fats, or at least decreasing polyunsaturated fats, and also decreasing your carbohydrate intake. So I think I answered one of your questions,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure what was the other one, if you can remind me.
I mean, see about the that's what I asked about, sat fat as well as the PUFA oils. How
Yeah, in
this is
heart disease.
beneficial. Yeah, how this is how that is harmful. How this is beneficial, which you actually
Yeah.
answered uh, to a good
Well,
extent.
let me talk about the human clinical trial data, because
Yeah.
that's the most rigorous kind of data that exists. So going back to 1961 with that American Heart Association recommendation, that was based on only observational data, which actually hadn't even been published yet. So it was based on very weak and very little data. Governments around the world understood that they needed to test Ansel Keys' hypothesis. And so what happened in the 1960s and 70s is that there was a large population in various clinical trials all over the world, usually funded by governments, to analyze whether or not saturated fat causes heart disease. Now, a clinical trial is the most rigorous kind of data that you can obtain. And these were all randomized, controlled clinical trials, the best kind of trial you can do. Many of them were in inpatient settings, something you couldn't do nowadays because it would be considered unethical, but testing people in mental hospitals and veterans hospitals. Then the good thing about that is that you really have much better control over what people eat because you're feeding them. Gives you more reliable data. And altogether, there were some 67,000 people tested all over the world. That means that the diet heart hypothesis has been tested more than any other nutrition hypothesis in the world. And at the end of the day, these trials taken together did not show that when somebody replaced saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats, so they ate margarine instead of butter, they had soy-filled milk, soy-filled cheese instead of the regular foods, they had on average about 9% of their calories as saturated fats versus what was thought as common at the time, which is 18% of calories as saturated fats. At the end of the day, the group reducing their saturated fats did not benefit, did not have lower death rate did not have lower coronary mortality, did not have lower mortality at all. And in most analyses did not have any reduction in heart attacks, myocardial infarction. A study has since shown that when a very large observational study that is taking place globally called the PURE study has since shown that the more saturated fats one eats, it turns out to be protective against stroke. So low saturated fat diets are associated with a higher risk of stroke. But the clinical trial data is really the most rigorous data that we have. And for many years, and this is sort of the political part of the story that I think is when anybody asks me how much is politics and how much is science in this story, quite a lot of it is politics. Those studies and their results from the 1960s and 70s were largely ignored. They were not discussed. They're what is called silent studies in anthropology, which is the term to sort of talk about studies that come out and nobody talks about them. They're not cited. They're not discussed. And so they were sort of lost from the scientific, sort of general scientific knowledge. And it wasn't until really 2010 was the first time that a team of scientists started to look back at that data again. And they came to the conclusion, maybe we got it wrong on saturated fats. And now there have been 20 such papers that have reviewed all the data from teams of scientists, independent teams all over the world, coming to the same conclusions. I don't mind actually just sort of showing you a couple of those papers.
Please.
Let me see. This is one of them where they reviewed 17 of those meta-analyses on those original clinical trials and concluded diets that replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat do not convincingly reduce cardiovascular events or mortality. We must consider that the diet hard hypothesis is invalid or requires modification. So this is what's known as an umbrella review. It's a review of review papers. And I think this paper is really the most significant paper ever published on this subject, which it's significant in a number of ways. It was published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, which is a very influential journal in the United States. And so that's part of its significance. It was recently just named one of the 100 top papers of 2020 by the editor-in-chief of this journal. And it is also very significant because 3 of the authors on this list were members of one of the expert committees that actually makes our dietary guidelines or evaluates the science for our dietary guidelines. So these are people responsible for that science saying, we think we got this wrong, which is not an easy thing to do. This is really quite a good paper to read. And they they go through all the LDL explanation in quite a lot of detail. They talk about the clinical trial data. And they come to the conclusion that really we should no longer have caps on saturated fats. So I think that this shows you that the most rigorous data on saturated fats really do not support the conclusion that this is the driver of heart disease. We have yet to have this major scientific shift in understanding kind of move up to the level of official policy. Like our official policy is still to put a cap on saturated fats. And that is due to a lot of other interests and influence that go into policymaking. But in the scientific community, the opinion has clearly shifted, or we can say that the science is clearly not settled at this point.
And rightly, as you pointed out, there are studies like Sydney Heart Study or Veterans LA studies, which actually shown that in spite of reducing LDL with PUFA, there were no reduction in events. In fact, they may actually shown the reverse also. And as you rightly say, the PURE study, in fact, I recall back, 2016 or somewhere, standing in the stage somewhere in Zurich, when Salim Yusuf openly told that I think what Nina Teicholz said was right. That was a moment of thrill for all of us. And me and Anup Singh, we were very thrilled. That a big personality like Salim Yusuf openly telling, that you are actually right. That was the time when, whatever investigations you have done was actually vindicated. It was really something, cannot be compared.
It was quite controversial
Yeah,
when
yeah,
he
yeah, yeah.
stood up. Salim Yusuf is the head of the Pure Study, and he's
Yeah,
a
yeah,
past president of the World Heart Federation.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that is the group that covers all the heart associations all over the world. And he said, I think it's something like Nina Teicholz shook up the nutrition
yeah.
world, but she was right, and he received quite a blowback from saying that. But still, you can see if you talk to scientists, they will acknowledge this point. It's just that sort of the official line really has yet to shift. Fiona Godley, who's the editor in chief of the British Medical Journal, she also at a conference said, we clearly got it wrong on saturated fats, and I think we owe a big mea culpa to the public on this subject. So there are voices speaking out, and those voices are growing, and certainly gratifying to see. I mean, evidence is just so obvious now that I think it's hard to deny. And yet, when I looked at our last, the last effort of our guidelines, I mean, they literally just ignored all the evidence. One of my findings, I'll just show you one thing.
Yeah,
I
please.
A finding of mine, I went back and looked through all of our dietary guidelines to see if in any iteration they come out every 5 years and they review the science. And this is an article that I wrote for the BMJ. It was actually a cover story, also highly controversial in the end. But one of my findings that was not contested was that none of our expert committees had ever done its own systematic review of these clinical trials on saturated fats. These clinical trials on 67,000 people had never been directly reviewed by any dietary guidelines expert committee, which is quite shocking because we've had this advice for decades now, 40 years, and they've never looked at the most rigorous, strongest evidence on it. So that's more politics
Yeah.
for you.
So, Nina, thanks for taking us back, to know what is the traditional fats we have used and how these vegetables oils have come. So, one curious question, which, I'm just preempting, some of the audience here is going to ask. In
Yes.
India, ghee, butter were all traditional cooking medium, and possibly even coconut oil. Yes, it's one of the old, especially used in coastal areas. But some of the other oils which are used are cold pressed mustard oil, which was prevalent in northern and eastern part, and cold pressed peanut oil maybe in western and southern part, and then cold pressed sesame oil, especially in southern part. So what is your view about cold pressed mustard, peanut and sesame oil?
Yeah, I looked into these a little bit, and I want to first explain the concept of, you remember that squiggly molecule I
Yeah,
showed you
yeah,
with
yeah,
all the double
yeah,
bonds. So because it has multiple double bonds, that's called a polyunsaturated fat. Poly is for the multiple double bonds, and you can see that the more double bonds, uh, the more likelihood you have for oxidation. Each of those double bonds can open up. So there are polyunsaturated fats, and then there's something called monounsaturated fats. Mono means only one double bond, so that is less likely, fewer chances for oxidation. The most famous oil that is mostly monounsaturated is olive oil, and that is mostly made up of these monounsaturated fats called oleic fatty acids. Canola oil is a created oil out of Canada, and that is also very high in this monounsaturated fats, or higher. I'm sad to say that the oils that you referred me to are quite high in polyunsaturated fats.
yeah.
So here's sesame oil. It's 42% polyunsaturated fats. And 39% monounsaturated fats. So that's, I would say, quite an unstable fat. Any fat that is unstable in that way is not, it's not advisable to heat and use for cooking, because it will oxidize. It's also important to, if you use it for cold, in cold applications, or in salad dressings or sauces, it's important to keep that stored in a dark bottle so it doesn't oxidize, it doesn't not exposed to sunlight, or keep it in a cabinet. So heat and sunlight and time, over time, these oils will go rancid. Once they smell bad, you really shouldn't use them. Mustard oil is only 20% polyunsaturated, but it also is 30 to 40% erucic, which is a fatty acid that in large amounts is known to be unhealthy and dangerous because it interferes with your heart muscle. So I would be careful about using large amounts of mustard oil for that reason. Peanut oil is also unfortunately not my favorite. It's 30% polyunsaturated fats and about 50% monounsaturated fats. So, uh, so that is, perhaps a better profile than sesame oil, but it's still pretty high in these polyunsaturated fats. Ghee, by contrast, has only 3% polyunsaturated fats and 89% saturated fats. So that's 89% stable fats, 3% unstable fats. It is by far the best choice for cooking. And butter is similar, although ghee is better than butter for cooking, as you all surely know, and why ghee was invented, because butter burns and ghee does not. There's an interesting experiment about on India that was done in the 1960s that I think just sort of reflects these.
Malhotra
The
Indian Railway
Malhotra
study.
study, yeah. So maybe you all know this already, but it was one of those silent studies that came out and nobody talked about it. And I was sort of dazzled when I stumbled across it in my research. It was on more than 1 million railroad workers in India in the
Yeah.
60s. It went on for 5 years. It was men exclusively. And they found that in the north, they were eating 19 times more fat, and most of it was dairy fat. So most of it was more saturated. In the south, they were eating less fat altogether, and mostly it was ground nut fat, which I think must be peanut oil, but
Same,
I'm
same.
not
It's the
sure.
same. It's the same. It's the
The
same.
peanut oil. The results were that the rates of heart disease in the north were 1/7 of that in the south, and they were also the Southerners on the peanut oil died 7 years earlier on average than those in the North. And Malhotra concluded, sort of tentatively, because this is in the time of the diet heart hypothesis, nobody wants to come out against it. But he said, the people in the South should eat more fermented milk products such as yogurt sherbet, and butter. So that's that's probably the largest observational study that
Yeah.
that I know about, or one of the largest, certainly. And the conclusion was really that those oils were not healthy. And there's other, that there are data also from other sources, not as definitive, or maybe not as much data as that, but there's a good deal of data to show that polyunsaturated fats are may in fact be dangerous. I'll just tell you one other thing from those clinical trials on the 67,000 people, which is one of the findings was that people on the polyunsaturated vegetable oils consistently died in all these experiments at significantly higher rates from cancer. And this was of such concern to people, scientists, that the National Institutes of Health, our highest scientific body in our country, had convened a series of conferences in the early 1980s to discuss this problem of higher death rate from cancer, and they really could not solve it. They couldn't understand why. They had a number of ideas, but nobody really could understand it, and they decided that it's just so important to fight heart disease that they were going to ultimately sort of ignore this side effect of cancer. So so we have cancer, and then we have the inflammatory effects in the body. Heart disease now is seen by many scientists as an inflammatory process. So you have two concerning effects of these oils. Also, when they're heated, and this is in chapter 9 in my book, which was just stunning to find out that the oils, when they're heated, especially say in restaurant fryers or in home kitchens, but they degrade very rapidly into many kind of degraded triglyceride products, into all kinds of polymers, all sorts of substances that are highly, highly unstable, including known toxins. One of them is named aldehydes, which is a known toxin to the system, known to cause cancer, known to have other toxic effects, and be a factor in heart disease. So Interestingly, I mean, these oils have experienced recently a sort of comeback because when we became aware of trans fats, I'd have to, do you mind if I just take a moment to
Yeah,
explain
yeah,
this?
please, please.
So, that process that I discussed earlier of hydrogenation to create Crisco, that was hardening the oil. The reason that they did that, the reason they hardened the oil was because the oil was unstable and oxidized and caused inflammation. They knew that was a problem. The process of hydrogenation had a byproduct that came out of it called trans fats. And people started researching this in the 1970s and being concerned about trans fats. And finally, sort of the mainstream scientific community caught on, and they have been limited or banned. They're banned in the United States now in any product. But what did that mean for food manufacturers, and especially in restaurants, big restaurants? It meant that they could no longer use these trans fats to fry their food or cook their food. Everybody was using trans fats or these partially hydrogenated oils for their fryers, for their cooking things. Almost all restaurants were using these partially hydrogenated oils. Now they couldn't use them. Trans fats were banned. And so what they went back to is using just regular oils. That was the cheapest solution, and that was the easiest solution. And so they started just using soybean oil and other kinds of oils. Soybean is the cheapest in the US, at least. This created huge problems that and things like they were hardening and clogging the drains in restaurants. They were building up on the walls of these restaurants like kind of dried paint. They were so unstable that the uniforms of the workers, when taken to be cleaned in the back of the truck, would just spontaneously combust because there were such unstable molecules on them. They would combust in the dryers after they had been cleaned. So this was an enormous, although not much discussed, problem for the restaurant industry, especially big chains like McDonald's. And they developed a number of solutions to try to limit the impact of this oxidation that was going on. And they created things like nitrogen blankets to put on top of the fryers, or silicone beads that put inside the fryers to absorb these degraded polymerized fatty acids. So actually, those restaurants, ironically, may be safer than some of the smaller family-owned restaurants that don't know about this issue or can't afford to be changing their oils all the time and just reuse the oils over and over, as you said earlier. It's particularly just a problem now that really has not been solved. So I think it really is cause for concern. I think in that we don't really know all the effects of these oils. There are theories about how it interferes with the whole Krebs cycle. For those of you who remember that in biology, but the cycle in each and every one of your cells that creates energy, it interferes with that cycle. And I mean, they lodge in cell membranes and affect the permeability of your cell membranes. So
Especially it affects the electron transport chain, so very specifically linoleic acid.
right,
Yeah.
linoleic and
Yeah.
linoleic and
Yeah.
linolenic are the
Linoleic,
two
yeah.
main polyunsaturated fatty acids. Anyway, I think in the big picture, it's really hard to know what is the effect of these vegetable oils versus other things in our food supply that we know that to be bad for our health. So, I mean, the big question I think out there is, we know that reducing sugars and things that turn to sugar in our bloodstream, so carbohydrates generally, we know that there's a great deal of experimental evidence showing that if we reduce that our health, we can improve our health and reverse diseases. Most people, when they go on a low carbohydrate diet or strict carbohydrates, also become educated about vegetable oils because that is sort of the
Yeah.
community now out there. And so they also might be shifting to more natural fats. So it could be that these trials are looking at people who are doing both those things. Um, and if you look at the historical data, vegetable oil is coming into the population pretty much at the same time that sugar is coming in a big way into the population. So they could have, it could be that vegetable oils sort of accelerates the process that carbohydrates are starting. I think there's a lot of discussion and dispute over these issues, so I don't feel like I can really answer them.
Yeah. So thanks, Nina.
So
I think this was very, very extensive investigations you have done, extensive data you have shown, and
sorry about the phone.
there'll be a lot of other questions coming in on still on this. So, Nina, it's already almost 1 hour, so very short. In a very, the other topic is red meat. If you can
Yes.
just spend 5 minutes on, on your view on red meat, as well as your something which you founded, nutrition coalition. So we'll just come to, so on the red meat, generally what is the issue, why it is demonized in such a way, you know uh,
Well, this is a huge issue,
yeah.
and I think that we really there's so much to say on this subject. I will. Here's some basic things to say. Most of the our ideas about red meat being bad for health come from observational or epidemiological studies. So those are the kinds of studies that show associations but cannot show cause and effect. And in fact, the associations between red meat and some of the more worrisome outcomes, especially cancer, are tiny. They're tiny. For cancer, colorectal cancer, which is the decision that was made by the World Health Organization, the what's called the relative risk, but the strength of that association was almost one, and one means no association. So they're they're very, very tiny. They're weak. It's a weak basis of evidence with very weak associations. In 2019, there were a series of papers that were published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and it's really the first time that a team of scientists had undertaken to review all the data on red meat, not just the epidemiological studies, but also any existing clinical trials that they could find. They did this using a system called GRADE, which is it's like a system for reviewing science that is well respected. It's used by nearly 200 public health organizations all over the world. And it's a fairly rigorous approach to evaluating the science. And the conclusion in that series of papers, looking at cardiovascular outcomes, cancer outcomes, some diabetes indicators, and mortality, death, they said that the quality overall of the evidence was very, very low quality, low certainty, and that there was very little evidence overall, a very little rigorous evidence. And ultimately, they came out with a guideline that said, we have so little evidence on red meat that we cannot tell you what you should do. They in this guideline, they take into consideration what they call patient preference, but that is like, what is your desire? What do what is your culture, your heritage, your own tastes and desires? And they said you should be eating what you want, because we cannot tell you, we don't know enough to tell you otherwise, which I think is quite groundbreaking in the realm of dietary guidelines, because there's such a desire to tell people what to do, even if it's based on not much evidence. These papers were really hotly disputed, not so much the science, but there was an effort to try to bring them down by suggesting that there were conflicts of interest among the authors, which were really distant and not relative to the papers. But it revealed the politics of the situation on red meat, which is that there's a tremendous amount of money at the moment that is trying to promote vegetarian and vegan ways of eating that really have, it's all sorts of commercial interests that are interested in these fake food markets. It's a huge booming area for food products. There was $3.2 billion in 2020 alone invested in that market. And so there's that interest. There's the concerns about climate change that dovetail with all these corporate interests. And those are fueling a sort of drive to get rid of meat. There are animal rights activists who also converge in their interests. There's the influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which has been researched by a great deal by Belinda Fettke. And she, if you are interested in that topic, I mean, there's really a sort of huge constellation of forces that are against meat. And red meat, the space to even talk about red meat has sort of constricted because it has now become part of our culture wars. So that it's people who eat red meat, even people, many people eat it because they have immune conditions. They really cannot, they find themselves just less sick eating red meat. But I think there's been an effort to sort of create a political, to politicize eating of red meat. So in our country, at least, you're a conservative, gun-toting climate denier if you eat red meat, and that's not the reality of sort of the public health concerns or the public health issues around red meat and why people might eat it. Why might you eat red meat? There's a number of reasons. It is extremely dense in the vitamins and minerals that are needed for life, including the kind of heme iron and vitamin B12 and selenium and zinc. I mean, there's a number of things that are commonly deficient in many countries, and they are available in their most bioavailable form in red meat. So the iron content of red meat is twice that of white meat from the iron available in poultry, and you really can't get those nutrients when you try to get them from plant foods. They are not as bioavailable, meaning your body can't absorb them as well. And also, many people can't absorb them from supplements. So even though you might take iron supplements, as I used to when I didn't eat red meat because I was anemic, it never made any difference in my iron scores. And I'm one of those people who can't absorb iron from supplements. And many people are like that. So these deficiencies are serious. They're not trivial. Vitamin B12 is essential to having a healthy child and not having physical delays or neurological problems. And so red meat, and especially actually liver, is these are the foods that are the most dense in all the minerals and vitamins needed for life. I would say that shellfish is other excellent source of vitamin B12 if you're fortunate to have access to it. But this conversation about the need, that the nutrients that we need from red meat and our inability to get them from other sources is a conversation that for some reason we are not having on a national or an international level, because this vegan diet is now on the verge of being accepted by the United Nations. And we are not having this conversation about, well, as you should with any policy, okay, these might be the potential benefits, but what are the costs? Are there any costs? There has not been a single conference that has, or meeting where the two sides of a policy ought to be, considered and discussed together. But to take a nutrient-rich source out of our food supply is deeply concerning, when you consider human health. So that's my quick summary on red meat. I don't know
So
if that's
thanks, Nina. Thanks.
helpful.
It's really excellent, wonderful. You have made it everything clear. Just as a take-home point, the in fact the relative risk or even the hazard ratio has been shown very less with red meat, whereas smoking, the hazard ratio has been shown as much as 30 or even 40. So very significant difference. However, still they compare with meat with smoking, which is very surprising. So thanks, Nina. And final, a couple of lines about the Nutrition Coalition, something which you have founded.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
the Nutrition Coalition is a nonprofit. It is a group in Washington D.C. It does not accept any industry funds. Our work is to try to ensure that our nutrition policy is based on a rigorous scientific process, which it is not currently. There's no systematic methodology like GRADE or another international standard. It has been criticized by our national academies of sciences. That has criticized the dietary guidelines for not being transparent. There's no they don't reveal the conflicts of interest on the expert panel. They do not review the science in a way that is rigorously systematic. So we have been raising awareness about those issues and trying to sort of bring them to the fore. We are up against big food, big pharma. There are formidable interests
Yeah.
on the other side of this battle, but we really are the only group anywhere in the world currently trying to show that our dietary guidelines really are not based on rigorous evidence. So if you want to learn more about our work, we're at nutritioncoalition.us. And I think, we need a group like this in every country because unfortunately, one of the exports of the United States to the rest of the world was our dietary guidelines,
Yeah.
which I'm sorry about that.
I mean, that is followed across the world. So whether it is dietary guidelines or whether it is medical recommendations, the association, professional association, it's followed across the world. So that's how it is. So thanks, Nina. Thanks for enlightening us for so much on the cooking fat, cooking oil, and the audience here are just waiting. When we will open up the.
I'm
Uh,
happy to take questions. Yeah.
so I'm just unmuting. So there have been some questions on anyone wants to ask. I've unmuted. People can unmute actually. So if they want, they can just ask. Whether olive
Well,
oil
I'm
is
looking
good.
at here. There's a couple of questions about coconut oil.
Yeah,
Maybe I'll talk about coconut oil for just
yeah, yeah,
and palm oil.
yeah.
So coconut oil it has the highest concentration of saturated fatty acids than any other substances, like in the 95 or 98% saturated fatty acids. So it is, in fact, the most stable of all the um, the fats out there for cooking. It's a wonderful fat for cooking if you like the taste. So I would definitely recommend that. Palm oil is not used so much by individual consumers, but it has become the backbone of the food industry because when they were no longer able to use partially hydrogenated oils, they needed a solid fat. They desperately needed a solid fat because you can't have oily products sitting on supermarket shelves sort of going rancid. So they switched from partially hydrogenated fats largely to palm oil. It's cheap, comes from Malaysia and mainly. And the problem there, I think, is that it involves destroying the rainforest, and there are increasing concerns about its environmental and ecological impact. However, it is from a human health standpoint, I think that is a safe oil. Safe oil. So, and if you don't want to contribute to destroying the rainforest, you can eat instead animal fats.
I think
um,
regarding palm oil, something to make it clear is which is good for health is this the PKO or the palm kernel oil, which is not usually used, and most of the oil which are found, the palm oil, all RBD, refined bleach and deodorized, so they are as good or as bad as any of the oils, so it should be avoided. And I think the red oil or the palm kernel oil is not available too freely, which is very high in sat fat, and that may not be
Correct.
used.
Thank you
So
for that.
yeah.
It's a good distinction to make.
And people have been asking about olive oil. Should olive oil be fried,
Yeah.
used for deep fried?
Well, again, I think it's better to use a saturated fat for cooking than. But if you are going to use an oil, olive oil is certainly the best one to use. It does oxidize, but if you look at the studies, you look at the level of oxidation, olive oil is always right in the middle between the polyunsaturated fats and the saturated fats in terms of oxidation. So it's what you would expect from the number of double bonds, which is only one in mono unsaturated fat, but it's not as good as a saturated fat.
So there's one more burning question: which is the best medium to fry? So
You know,
for deep fry.
it depends what you can get. I mean, we use, McDonald's French fries used to be fried in tallow, and if you can get tallow, I think that's a good. It's very stable and it's a very good frying fat. Lard is interesting because the way that pigs are raised now makes the lard less saturated than it used to be. It's now higher in unsaturated fats, but lard is still a good cooking fat. I mean, in our country, we used to make bacon and then fry the eggs in the bacon fat, and I will still take the bacon fat and send it through a paper towel or a coffee filter and save that fat for cooking. It's also a very economical way of saving fat. There's an interesting advertisement that came out during World War II in our country, which said, "Don't be a fat waster." And it urged people to do things like this, like save their bacon fat, because those critical and needed fats were needed to send off to the troops so that they would have energy, the proper energy that they needed to fight. Anyway, not really relevant to your question,
And I
but still
think
interesting.
I think in India it is best. The question asked by Vibha Gupta. So the best medium to fry is ghee. Go ahead and
Right.
go ahead and use, because see, lard, tallow, sweat may not be very popular in India. What is popular is ghee. So go ahead and fry in ghee. Absolutely, there is no issue. And someone asked a question about whether ruminants are good for health. Yeah, of course, very optimal for health. If someone is a meat eater in India, so they can go ahead and have ruminants. Absolutely, possibly that's what Nina has told about red meat. One of the best, highly nutritious, and will take care of all the deficiencies. So absolutely, go ahead and have, if you can have.
Yeah. So somebody asked, can they become a member of the Nutrition Coalition? We don't actually have members, but you can sign up for our newsletter and also just send us an email if you're interested in helping out or
Uh,
working with us in any way. Um, Somebody
Dr.
else asked,
Yeah,
yeah.
Dr. Tanmoy Das, he has asked a question. The cardiac toxicity of erucic acid of mustard oil was found only in study in rats and not in humans. Cold pressed mustard oil has been used in India for 5 centuries. But having said that, ghee is better. So,
Well,
Dr.
I actually
Tanmoy.
looked at the literature. It is true that the early studies were only on rats, and then there have been some human studies that have been done. I think you would need to look at this, and you're right that the human studies showed less toxicity, but there are some conflicting studies. I haven't looked at this subject in great detail, so I want to say that I'm not an expert on that, but agree that ghee is better.
I think if we read Western A Price website, they're given information that this was more of an agenda behind stopping the usage of mustard, and probably, as Dr. Tanmoy said, yes, these studies exist only in rat, not in humans. So there is some sinister plot behind it which we don't know. However, okay, that that's probably a different a topic altogether. So rice bran oil, absolutely no. I think let me preempt that that question. Absolutely, just stay away from rice bran oil, and not at all a good source. And cottonseed oil, okay, this is what I think Nina has already told. Cottonseed oil was a replacement for the whale oil to be used in machinery, and somehow it has come into existence into human food chain. And I know that cottonseed oil is valiantly used in all the commercial purposes, in all the, if you go and see, most of the pickles are made in cottonseed oil. Absolutely horrible, and it has to be chucked out of window or in the nearest garbage bin. So the last
So,
question, how
yes.
do we battle LDL versus CVD? Yeah, uh, I don't know, Nina, if you can address this. Anup Singh is asking, put that question at the last. How do we battle
There's
LDL versus CVD?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a growing body of scientific literature. You can look up the name David Diamond, who
Yeah,
has been an author on many of those papers. I would just collect a stack of those papers and take them into your doctor and just say, and that the least threatening way to make this point is to say, I understand that LDL lowering is perhaps useful with statins, whether or not you want to take a statin, but this has not been shown to be true in diet studies. I debated one of the most famous cardiologists in America, Steve Nissen, and made that point with him. And he sort of paused and said, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that before, but you're right." And then became sort of a convert on this subject, because what is threatening to cardiologists is the idea that their drugs might not work. But if you say, look, the diet studies, which you haven't really looked at because they're not taught them in medical school, the diet studies just show something different. And this is outside of their realm of expertise, and so they might be more willing to grant that. If you go and say that I don't believe in statins, then that's more of an
yeah.
argument. So it's good to stay out of those kinds of arguments with your doctor if you can. But again,
That's yeah, 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 yeah.
no, I mean, again, that's like why I think the dietary guidelines need to change, because in most medical professions, they simply download the dietary guidelines as the gold standard. And until that changes, that will be the gold standard. And it's very hard to go up against so many authorities. I think just one other way in which you can argue that, it's hard to argue against expertise, but look, look at what has been reversed in nutrition science. The pillars of our nutritional advice, a universe of experts thought that avoiding dietary cholesterol was the right thing to do. For decades and decades, a universe of experts believed that was true, no longer true. A universe of experts believed that the low fat diet was the right way to go. Now, no official body recommends the low fat diet anymore. In the US at least. So that is another pillar of dietary advice that is gone. So it is possible we have made mistakes in nutrition science. Nutrition science is hard to do. And there is historical examples of big reversals in nutrition, which can sort of maybe soften the environment for understanding maybe we got it wrong on this too.
There's a question. Dr. Kishan, he has asked, is there anything like Nutrition Coalition in India? Dr. Kishan, no, unfortunately, no. We don't have any such, probably we are just blindly following, whatever guidelines is there in US or the Western world. And Mr. Venkatesh asked, what are the strategies for changing guidelines? So I think, the foundations like, the Nutrition Coalition which Nina has developed, probably they are just doing a big job and they are just fighting everything. But however, I think we all need to realize there are two industries, who are behind, everything because it's going to benefit them. One is we all know that the food industry, for them this cholesterol business is highly profitable for them, so that they can keep rolling out junks. They will speak against cholesterol, they will speak against meat, so that they can keep on checking out junks. And then the other side is the pharma industry, which will keep out rolling out solutions for the disease caused by the first industry, that is food industry. So that's how it works. So people generally blame pharma industry. I don't think they are to be blamed first. It is the food industry to be blamed first, because they are the one who are creating the disease. Pharma is bringing out solutions, and which we are following it blindly. So I think we all need to realize, and sessions like how Nina is, they are playing very important part in making us realize that we need to address everything through food, and really the pills are not the
Yeah.
solution. So I think there are a lot of some one important question coming in is for joint pain. I'm not able to read that. Anup, can you read that question?
I can read it.
Yeah,
For
yeah,
joint pains
something.
or gout,
Gout
doc
doctor.
immediately said cut out
Ha
red
ha ha
meat. Is
ha
there
ha.
any reason for
Yes.
this? Just normal fear of, I would say normal fear of red meat. I've noticed that no matter what your condition is, my friend was recently diagnosed with an enlarged prostate. I mean, cutting out red meat is just the go-to for doctors' advice. I don't know why that has become so widespread, but there's clearly no indication that red meat causes any of these conditions. There are no clinical trials. In fact, let me tell you about a recent systematic review by the well-respected Cochrane Group out of the UK, and it found they could find absolutely no evidence of the vegan diet and heart disease. And I know from looking at the literature on vegan diets, there's no clinical trial evidence on the vegan diet for any kind of outcome showing that the vegan diet leads to better outcomes. So in a controlled clinical trial. So I think that it's clearly this kind of momentum behind the vegan diet is coming from something else, and it's not from science. And equally unfortunately, it's so pervasive in the medical profession. And I think that when I look at the history, it has been since the 70s really that there have been animal rights activist groups. There's a very strong one in the United States. They've just been able to get a hospital in Israel to go entirely vegan. I mean, they've been working on meatless days in the United States. They're really powerful groups that have been working on this for many decades now. And we see this, as I said, going up to the United Nations level, where in June there will be a conference where they're planned to adopt the near vegan, so-called Eat Lancet diet as the reference diet for the entire world. A diet which is I think 2% is of 2% of calories of meat is allowed, which is like this much meat. So I mean, there are forces that are enormous and very strong and have been working a very long time and are very organized. And so anybody who wants to start a nutrition coalition in India, I urge you. I mean, it is we are, I think, in danger of having some policy measures that take away our food choices.
So thank you very much, Nina. Yeah, let us see, how, whether we can do anything in India, maybe whether DLF can take a lead. However, of course, there are no such, big guidelines in India. It is just ape from the West. So, everyone looks up to the West to follow everything. So whether it is dietary guideline or medical guideline, however it is. So
Yeah.
Nina, thank you very much. I really thank you. In fact, you are doing a great job, being an investigative journalist. From there you come into, in a big way, nutrition. And your book is really making a lot of difference to, to everyone, including all of us in D Life. In fact, all of us in D Life, most of us have read your book, and it's really, it's worth its weight in gold, or whatever you may say.
Thank
and
you
uh,
so much.
and we are very glad that, we are very indebted that you could come and share your knowledge directly with us. And of course, we'll be uploading this recording in YouTube, so that, more and more Indians will be able to see this, and they can relate very well, because, when we talk about ghee, butter, coconut oil, they'll be able to relate very well, so that they'll be having little more clarity on, what kind of oils we can use. So Nina, thank you very much for appearing in DLF channel.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's really an honor to be able to address your group. I also want to end on an optimistic note, which is that you, all of you, are really just by example are on the forefront of change. I mean, there's more and more metabolic ill health across the world, in your country, my country, and to show that you can get better, reverse your disease, lose weight. You are the grassroots movement that is creating change. It just, it can't be ignored. The fact that when somebody reclaims their health, that is one of the most powerful arguments that anyone can make. So, my thanks to all of you. Thank
So
you for
thanks,
having me.
thanks, Nina, and thanks to all the participants, and especially those participants who have come from outside India. They have taken a lot of effort to join this from whatever time zone they are. So I thank you very much,
Right.
and please keep joining all our different podcasts. We are having different guests during different weeks. In fact, Nina, next week we are having one with Belinda Fetke, especially to
Oh,
talk
great.
on this plant
She's
biased.
super interesting.
So
Great.
so thank you very much, and I wish to see everyone in our next podcast, next week. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.